trying to figure out how to regulate something that changes as fast as cryptocurrency. I mean, it feels like trying to draw a map of a city while the buildings are still moving, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's incredibly complex.
And that uncertainty, that lack of a clear map, that's been one of the biggest points of tension for, well, anyone in the crypto space or even just watching it.
Exactly.
Which is why we're doing a deep dive today into what looks like a pretty significant announced shift from a major U.S. regulator, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. We're digging into statements made by SEC Chair Paul Atkins. This was during testimony to a Senate subcommittee just recently, June 3rd. And we're focusing specifically on how he says the agency plans to police crypto from here on out.
And what really jumped out immediately from that testimony, I think, is the core contrast Mr. Atkins presented. He basically stated the SEC would be moving away from what's often been called regulation by enforcement.
Right, the lawsuits, the settlements, kind of defining the space after the fact.
Exactly. Moving away from that towards relying on formal notice and comment rulemaking. That seems to be the central pivot described in the source material.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. That shift in the method itself sounds key. He also laid out his priorities, didn't he?
He did. Based on the testimony, Mr. Atkins wants to create a, quote, rational regulatory framework.
Okay.
And establish clear rules of the road for how crypto assets are issued, how they're held in custody, how they're traded, all the basics.
And a crucial point from the source, I thought, was that he said enforcement's role would then return to policing fraud and manipulation based on already established obligations.
Right. Not using enforcement actions as the main tool to, define those obligations in the first place. That's the distinction he made.
Got it. The testimony also touched on a couple of other related points.
Yeah, briefly. He mentioned the SEC's crypto task force. Apparently, that was launched back in January by the then acting chair, Mark Ueda.
Okay.
And its first report is expected sometime in the coming months.
And the source also notes a plan to disband the FinHub office. That rings a bell. Strategic Hub for Innovation and Financial Technology. Started in 2018.
That's the one. Mr. Atkins reportedly told the subcommittee that innovation needs to be ingrained into the culture SEC-wide, not just stuck in one small office.
Interesting. So, okay, our mission in this deep dive is really to go through these key points from the testimony, understand what this announced change in regulatory approach actually involves, at least based on what the SEC chair says he aims to achieve.
And why he says he's making this shift. Let's get into it.
Right. Let's start with the heart of it, this move from regulation by enforcement to notice and comment rulemaking. What does the testimony tell us about the thinking behind this? What does it really mean in practice?
Well, the testimony directly seems to address that criticism we mentioned, the one often leveled at the previous approach.
Which was
that using enforcement actions to define the rules just created massive uncertainty. It felt, retrospective. People felt like you only found out what the rule was when you got sued for supposedly breaking it.
Right. Not ideal for planning or innovation.
Not at all. And Mr. Atkins explicitly stated his approach would not be that. It would instead focus on this notice and comment rulemaking.
So what is notice and comment rulemaking then in this context? How did the testimony describe it?
It's described as the Commission's intended method to set fit-for-purpose standards for market participants.
Yeah.
Think of it like building the regulatory highway before you tell the cars exactly how to drive on it.
Okay, that makes sense. Laying down the rules clearly first.
Exactly. It's the standard process, really, for creating federal regulations. The agency proposes a rule, they publish it, let the public see it, get comments back from anyone interested in industry, investors, academics, the public, and then they consider all that feedback before finalizing the rule. The testimony links this directly to Mr. Atkins' goal of creating those clear rules of the road for crypto issuance, custody, and trading.
And the argument is that these clear rules are essential for protecting investors.
Yes, protecting them from fraud by giving everyone a predictable framework to operate within. That's the connection made in the testimony.
Ah, okay. So the argument presented is that building that clear framework up front through a formal public process is actually a more effective way to protect investors and maintain market integrity than mainly relying on legal actions after something's already happened.
Precisely.
And this connects back to his point about enforcement's role changing or shifting back.
Exactly. The testimony quotes Mr. Atkins saying the enforcement strategy will, quote, return to Congress's original intent.
Meaning
focusing on enforcing violations of rules that are already clear and established. He specifically cited fraud and manipulation, so it's framed as policing behavior against a known standard.
Not using the enforcement process itself to set that standard.
That's the core idea presented.
That sounds like a potentially, well, fundamental change in how the agency interacts with the industry, if it plays out as described in these statements. Now, the testimony also mentioned the crypto task force. What role does that play in this new approach, according to Mr. Atkins?
Well, according to the testimony, Mr. Atkins brought up the task force when he was asked about the complexities around crypto exchanges, places that handle both traditional securities and digital assets.
Right, that's a tricky area.
It is. And while he didn't give a super direct answer to that specific question in the testimony snippet, he did state the Crypto Task Force is actively working on regulations intended to, quote, make sense for the industry and that allow for innovation.
Okay.
And he reaffirmed, like we said, that this task force, set up in January, expects to release its first report in the next few months.
So the task force seems positioned, based on his words, as the engine that will actually develop that rational regulatory framework he's aiming for.
That seems to be the plan, yeah.
And it's explicitly tasked with considering innovation in that process. Which brings us to FinHub.
Right. The testimony also noted the plan to disband FinHub, the strategic hub for innovation and financial technology, which, was created back in 2018 specifically as a dedicated place for the SEC to engage with fintech developments.
So why get rid of an office specifically focused on innovation, especially in a field like crypto that moves so fast? What was the reasoning given in the testimony for that?
Yeah, it seems a bit counterintuitive at first glance. But the testimony explains Mr. Atkins sought approval to disband FinHub because, in his view, innovation should be ingrained into the culture SEC-wide and not limited to a relatively small office.
Integrated everywhere, not isolated.
That's the stated rationale. He said the core principles and priorities that FinHub was founded on are now being integrated into the very fabric of the SEC.
So the idea is to distribute that focus, that need to stay ahead of innovation throughout the entire agency, rather than just having it concentrated in one spot. It's presented as a way to make thinking about innovation a more pervasive part of how the SEC operates day to day.
That's the argument laid out in the testimony.
The testimony also briefly notes that since Mr. Atkins took over, the SEC has taken a slightly different tack in some areas, including dismissing some older enforcement actions and releasing specific guidance on staking.
Yes, the source connects those kinds of actions to this broader shift we've been talking about, the move away from the previous enforcement-heavy approach. It suggests a pivot towards providing more clarity up front, using formal processes like rulemaking and guidance documents instead.
Okay, so let's try and bring together the core ideas from the testimony that we've walked through. We've definitely looked at the big announced shift by SEC Chair Atkins, moving away from regulation by enforcement.
And towards notice and comment rulemaking. Very different processes.
Right, with the stated aim being to create clear, predictable rules, using a public process, all supposedly to enhance investor protection, especially around how crypto assets are issued, held, and traded.
And we also talked about the role of the Crypto Task Force, which is presented as the group actually developing that new framework, supposedly with innovation in mind.
And then there's the plan to disband FinHub, with the stated goal of embedding that innovation thinking across the whole agency, rather than keeping it siloed.
So I think what's interesting for you, the listener, to consider here is how this fundamental shift in how regulations are approached, moving from primarily using enforcement actions to define the rules towards this formal public rulemaking process, how that might actually alter the landscape for the crypto industry based on the SEC chair's stated goals.
Yeah, that process change feels really central, which leaves us with a potentially provocative question, thinking only about the reasoning presented in the testimony we've discussed today. Considering the SEC's stated goals fostering innovation and establishing clear rules, and coupling that with the decision to disband the dedicated fintech hub, FinHub, with the stated aim of integrating innovation agency-wide, how might these actions, as described in the source, collectively impact the agency's practical ability to actually keep pace with and effectively regulate a field as rapidly evolving as crypto?